right there with him. And each day we have an email that goes out at 6 o'clock called Last Call. And he and I work on an editorial cartoon each day, and it goes in there. So I've had him just kind of put together some cartoons just to kind of guide my conversation, or our conversation today. So first, theme of the speech is obviously, for me, you saw it, Florida politics is drinking from a fire hose right now, upside down. And that's literally what it feels like from the political reporting side and from the people that are involved. It's so interesting, and the way I like to think about it, and it's interesting that I use this reference, but I think Florida's kind of turned into the foreign bureau for a lot of the major news outlets. You know, the New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, a whole slew of national outlets basically look at Florida the way they used to look at London. And so you've got these great reporters here, Mark Caputo, Patricia Mazzai, I'm probably butchering her name, Steve Contorno, who now is with CNN, was at the Tampa Bay Times. They basically posted up here, and then there's this also, this fascination with Florida man, of which I think, there's some good arguments that that's kind of a pejorative in a way, that it belittles basically sometimes mentally unstable people who run in a really bad situation. But then I'm a Florida man. I actually was a Florida man. I have my own Florida man story, if you all want to Google it. I was the guy who stopped the Starbucks Pay It Forward on the day of the Democratic primary. I went out to Tyrone Square Mall. I was just so fed up.
Terrible, isn't it?
Okay, really? Okay, so so all the pictures are going to make it look like, well, you know what this looks like. Some of you do. And so, I said, man, you got bad timing. You can just say louder after I get done with my anecdote. And so I broke that up, and it became a viral sensation. The funny part about it, as it applies to this audience, was on the day of the Democratic primary. My wife was helping Charlie Crist in 2014, and so this was all going down, and there was TV cameras down we were in Broward for the election night party, and Charlie Crist was upset that I was getting more media attention than he was. Just to give you a sense, a very generous update, but I think the thing that's cool about what we're doing, and this is our push, is FloridaPolitics.com does have the largest political reporting footprint now in Florida, which is embarrassing for the state of journalism. There should be more political reporters. I should not be the one breaking a scoop about Mar-a-Lago. And in fact, if you read the stories that I was interviewed about that, it was embarrassing. I was scared because that was such a sensitive. I knew what that was. It was having a ring of power, to reference Bill's obsession, in my hand, and I knew that if I put that matzo ball out there, it was going to stir up some shit. And obviously it did, and it has, and it brought everything back up. And I actually ended up calling a reporter at Politico that I trust, and a reporter at the New York Times that I worked with a lot, and who's always treated me decently as a source, because I said to them, hey, I'm going to roll this out, and you got 5 minutes head start on the rest of your news. Funny story about that was, so Maggie Haberman, the great Trump chronicler, was who I first went to go give that to. And Maggie had always followed me on Twitter, but for some reason, she wasn't following me on Twitter anymore. And so I wasn't able to DM her. And I'm like, well, you know what? You're going to lose that. And so she said, this week, I'll never unfollow you again. Sign up for Sunburn, that's our morning email. I think a lot of you do. It's a great thing. We work on it all day. A bunch of us work on it now. It's a team project. We've got a magazine, Influence. That's coming out with the another funny story. One of the things that happens, just like I used to imitate Adam Smith all of the time. I stole his winners and loser of the week idea. So we roll out the Influence 100, which is a once every 2 years listing of the most 100 influential people in Florida politics. There's a new group called City and State out there. They're doing the Power 100. If you remember, Coming to America, McDonald's, and then like Eddie Murphy was working at the other one across the street, McDowell's. We're kind of dealing with that right now, and so the Influence 100 will be out. I'm doing everything to make sure I get my list out first before McDowell's gets out of your list. Okay, so let's look really quick. I'm going to fly through some stuff because your questions are always good. First slide, I think we got to take a step back and look at the dumpster fire. That was Nikki Fried's gubernatorial campaign. And why did she lose? All right, number one, she was never going to win. Okay, and that's one of the mistakes looking back at that race. Some of you probably saw some of the reporting that said from a UNF polling outfit that said Nikki Fried was up 4 points. I do a lot of work with St. Pete polls. We had a poll, our final poll was 0.4% off the final mark, which was Charlie Crist, by almost 29%. When you look at where we started polling, back when we first did our first, first of the year kind of polls, the race was basically Charlie Crist plus 20, plus 25. Nobody believed it was that big of a lead. We kept polling and we kept coming up with the same numbers. Now, I love Charlie Crist, but I don't put my thumb on the scale on the polling numbers. I get them back in the middle of the night, get excited, work on them, and roll them out. And they are what they are. Sometimes they go against things that I don't like. I don't like some of it's heartbreaking to call a friend and tell them, hey, you're down 14, not 3. So Nikki was never really in contention. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because Charlie Crist thought that she was in contention. And so he ended up spending in the last 2 weeks about $2.1 million on negative ads against Nikki Fried. And that's money that he won't have against Ron DeSantis. Why did Nikki lose? So Nikki was, and I think this is what's going to happen about her, or her legacy will be that she was an accidental winner in 2018. She barely beat a guy named Matt Caldwell, who is himself an accidental winner. He won because he had the support of the NRA in a 3-way primary. The early consensus was a woman named Denise Grimsley was going to be the person who won. And I think that if Denise had gotten through the primary, she would have beaten Nikki Fried. Nikki Fried, we wrote all of the stories about Nikki Fried thinking about running for governor and then when she ran for agricultural commissioner. And as long as you promise not to, nobody can tell her this, and let's just keep it in this room. We used to write those stories because we knew that they would get clicks because everybody in Tallahassee thought it was such an incredible joke that this lobbyist who had been a marijuana lobbyist and who had a reputation for having a good time was going to run for agriculture. Now I will say, Nikki Fried was held up to an incredibly difficult double standard. And I think that that's important that Democrats kind of recognize that. She got criticized for being engaged to a married man at the time he was still married. There was a lot of stuff about her, financial disclosures involving him, etc. I don't think that I've seen as much scrutiny over men who do a far lot worse than what Nikki Fried did. And she just never escaped that vortex of her personal life. I think also she just was never really comfortable being a Democrat. This is someone who has campaigned campaigned for Republicans. She sued the president of the Democratic president of the United States. I think honestly, when we look back, that was the moment we knew she was not going to win. When she launched a fight against Joe Biden at the nadir of Joe Biden's presidency, it just seemed like she didn't feel comfortable being a Democrat. And so, she ran, I think, a very a weird campaign. I think it was I don't want to say fraudulent like Donald Trump fraudulent, but I think that it was all smoke and mirrors. And it will be one of the reasons why I think Charlie Crist ends up losing is that he was so distracted with this. If he had been able to get in there on Memorial Day and just hammer against Ron DeSantis, I think he would have a better shot. Next one. Just taking a step back really quick at what is going on, and this applies to us locally. The Republicans gerrymandered the shit out of our congressional districts. There is no other way to put it. And when you're backed up by a Republican Supreme Court, and that is the last arbiter of whether or not they're gerrymandered, you can basically get away with it. And we're going to see that when they go through the depositions, just like the last decade, we saw that it was basically state Republican consultants who drew the maps. We are going to find out that it was basically national Republicans who drew these maps for Ron DeSantis' office. It will take us years to get to that. And that's not necessarily, that's not illegal, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But the idea that all of a sudden Ron DeSantis rolled out these maps after the Florida Senate, the Republican Florida Senate, passed maps that people signed off on and were widely credited for being relatively fair while still striking a Republican majority. The idea that there is only going to be one Democratic seat between basically Orlando and the Gulf beaches is just insane, and it's not reflective of the diversity, political diversity of Central Florida. Now, I will say this. There's some interesting voter registration numbers. I ask you, and maybe I'll come back in November and I'll be wrong, I don't buy the narrative, and you'll see some of this, that the Republicans, they are now ahead of Democrats in voter registration. I think by about 250,000 registrants. Number one, a lot of that is panhandle Democrats who had always performed as Republicans, now just registering as Republicans, especially because of Donald Trump. Number two, 250,000 into this big of a pool of voters is not that big of a thing. If Democrats, we will say this forever about Democrats, if they turn out Broward, if they turn out Palm Beach, they can win. The problem is they don't turn out Broward, they don't turn out Palm Beach. Also, I think there are a lot of new Democrats here in Florida who have not been registered yet because Democrats have not done voter outreach or registration outreach. They put on the masks and didn't go door to door. Republicans took off the masks and knocked on doors and registered voters. Credit to them for that. But even at that, we just did a couple of stories on Florida politics. Scott Powers, veteran journalist, great guy. There are actually a lot more competitive seats in Florida by registration. Now, that's not the same as performance, but like CD15, the Laurel Lee Allen Cone district, it's only a 1,500 registration swing. Now, it performs overwhelmingly for Republicans, and it's going to be very difficult for Allen Cone to beat future President Laurel Lee. Laurel Lee definitely wants to run for president. This is a stepping stone. She is on her way. But these seats are winnable. I think in CD13, that's the other interesting race around here. That is Ultra MAGA Anna Paulina Luna, former Maxim model. Credit to her for that. Running against Eric Lynn, who is a former Obama guy. He's as dry as a popcorn fart, but he is interesting in the sense that he can raise money. I have a feeling if the Roe wave continues to come in, I think those Pinellas moderate voters who have been there for 75 years are going to look at Anna Paulina Luna. They're going to look back at who was represented that district: Bill Young, Charlie Crist, David Jolly, and I think that will be a much closer race. I think that is a possibility for the upset. If you could bet the spread, I would definitely take the underdog in that. Next slide, please. DeSantis. Right now, this guy just gets everything that he wants. And I will say, there was a little bit of an interesting theory that he was the Tim Pawlenty of this presidential cycle. That he was going to get out there so early. That he was going to fall apart and be maybe the first one out. Pawlenty was endorsed by a bunch of people in Florida, was the big money guy, and then he ended up falling apart. And then Scott Walker. There was a lot of comparisons of DeSantis to Scott Walker, the Wisconsin governor, who won 2 statewide races, won a recall effort, and thought that he was first out of the gate, I think in 16, to run for president, and ended up being first out of the gate in 16 when Trump and Jeb and all of them were running. There's something different, obviously, about DeSantis, and that's clearly an understatement, but the way he dominates other Republicans and his ability, as we are seeing that he works at all of the different levels of government, that he's not just involved with himself, that he got involved in the Jacksonville area state house race, where he basically pulled the candidate, Kyron Michael, out against 2 other establishment Republicans and was able to pull her across the finish line. Now, I would not buy too much into the school board narrative. Those people were going to win anyways. Sarasota was a little bit of an outlier in that they flipped Sarasota. But even there, Bridget Ziegler was going to win in Sarasota County. A lot of the people that Ron DeSantis won endorsed in the school board races. And I know that became a very popular narrative in the primary. They were on their way to win. In fact, I would say, and I'm working on a piece right now, we knocked out a lot of MAGA Republicans in the primary. And again, don't tell anybody that because I'm trying to moderate both sides of the party. I'm not a huge fan of the AOCs of the world, and I'm not a huge fan of the Anthony Sabatinis of the world. But if you look throughout Florida in the primaries, one of the big stories were all the MAGA Republicans really lost. People like Anthony Sabatini in CD7, who was on his way to running for Congress. The only person that really didn't lose, obviously, was Matt Gaetz. I think if you want to read something, go read the Joel Greenberg deposition that was in the Orlando Sentinel about the gangsterism that was happening with the Central Florida politics. I think the judicial system will eventually take care of Matt Gaetz. But many state legislative candidates, like in places up in the Panhandle, a guy, Mike Hill, he's a black Republican that believed in the Confederacy. Did that tell you anything about him? He lost. Are we almost out of time? Okay. Fast forward real quick. Give you a sense, just to give you a sense of where the races are. Right now, this is updated with all the polls that came out this week. There were several polls. I don't know how to pronounce it. Susquehanna, AARP. AARP had a bipartisan poll from Tony Fabrizio and John Anzalone, probably the gold standard. They're basically showing Florida at DeSantis +3 over Chris at 54. Fine, so I'll take questions since I used up all the time and didn't get through all my slides. But here, go to my last one. Go to my last one because I will say it, and it ties into the last one. One more. I don't know who I thought I was speaking to. Don't listen to anything I said. I thought Gillett was going to win by 7 points. And I had Hillary Clinton winning by 6. So, you bat 300 in baseball, you're an all-star, you predict 300 in political